The Spotlight, shining a light on podcasts and videos that have caught our attention.
Hi and welcome to The Spotlight. I'm Jen Spiker with another podcast worth sharing. There's a growing number of podcasts available on demand in the Vision app, which aren't heard on Vision Radio. One of those is Faith and Fostering, an Australian-made program where people of faith chat about foster care to encourage, edify and educate others on the journey. Each episode of Faith and Fostering is different. Sometimes it's an interview with a foster carer or foster child sharing their story. Other times it's focused on a particular topic relevant to people involved with fostering. Some episodes take more of a devotional approach. And that's the case with the episode I'm sharing with you today from Faith and Fostering team member Heather. We heard part of this devotion last time with Heather speaking about how hard times can be a refining process in our lives.
The Spotlight with Jen Spiker.
I want to skip across to Ezra chapter 3 and starting from verse 10. It says this: "When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord," and this is the rebuild of the temple, "the priests in their vestments, and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by King David of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good, his love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of the weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away." I love this. I love just the description of it. You've got the old temple that's been destroyed, you've got a new temple, and just the foundations have been laid. And the people are so overjoyed, they're so excited about these foundations because of the hope of what the future will bring, that there is actually a new temple that's being created, and so they celebrate and there's so much joy. But there's something else that's happening here. The older people, the older priests who remember the destruction and remember the hardship of these former years and remember the destruction of the old temple and the exile and all of these things that have happened to them, they are celebrating, but they're also weeping in lament for what has gone before. And there's this really fascinating thing for me, I think, through the refining process that we need to remember, that refining is something that's necessary to bring out our character and bring us to a new place where God can use us and where the best parts of us that He's placed within us will actually come to the forefront. So that all of the peripheral nonsense will be done away with. But there's also a process within the refining process that is painful, because we remember the fire, we remember the storm, we remember the hardships, and there's something that wells up within us, and it kind of feels like grief, and it kind of feels like lament. And there is a degree to which we need to allow ourselves these moments in time where we cry out to the Lord, where we weep because of what we remember, even though we know that we're on the cusp of God doing something amazing in our future as well. There's this kind of tension, I guess, in this passage where there is the hope for the future and the obvious thankfulness and gratitude for the future and what's about to come and what's going to happen, but at the same time, a sober reckoning with what has happened in the past. And I think that we need to be able to hold both in tension. I don't believe that God calls us to a place where we need to just turn our back on the past and then celebrate and walk on, as if in some sort of a shallow way, where we just say, oh, that doesn't matter and I'm over it, but rather to actually grieve through that process and acknowledge it and understand the difficulties that we've been through in the past before that refinement has been able to come to pass. The process of a reset is hard. And when God refines us, He's resetting us. There are things that happen through the refinement process that we love, that we find are removed from us. And in the midst of that, God is asking us to rediscover the foundations that matter, the things that won't be burned up in the refinement process. The Bible talks a lot about the refinement of gold as a metaphor for his people, actually, for God's people. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6, it says, "Lately you've had to put up with the grief of many trials, but these only reveal the sterling core of your faith, which is far more valuable than gold that perishes, for even gold is refined by fire. Your authentic faith will result in even more praise, glory, and honour when Jesus, the Anointed One, is revealed." I love this. Peter doesn't want the readers to see their trials as a testament to the inadequacy of their faith, but he rather describes their faith as gold, the most precious metal available. In fact, he even says their faith is more durable than gold. Now, I could guarantee that people who were being persecuted at the time would not feel like their faith was more durable than gold. It would have felt shaky. And this is sometimes something that can throw us off, because we can go through those hard times, those difficult times, we can go through the fire and the storm, and we can feel shaky. But what we need to remember is God is refining us like gold, and gold actually lasts. But here, even Peter is saying there's an opportunity for you to come to the place where you're so refined through this fire process that your faith can withstand even more than what gold could withstand. And I want to be in that situation. I think that's an awesome way to live life, to know that there's this confidence that somehow, even through the hardest of times, I can see the end of that. I can see the hope that is to come, because I can see that the hard times are not pointless. The hard times are a process where I get to be made new, where I get to be made purer, where I get to be made more fully into the person that God had the purpose for when he created me. You know, there's this that saying that says, when you squeeze a lemon, you get lemon juice. It's funny because that saying is not true of faith. What Peter is actually saying here is actually that when you squeeze a person, and faith actually should be the thing that comes out. What's happening is that the squeeze and the refining process should actually be creating the best part of ourselves to come out, not the worst part. Or it brings the dross, it brings the worst part to the surface so that it can be gotten rid of. But what you actually find in the core of the person is faith. And I think that's a really cool way to look at it. Proverbs chapter 27, verse 21 says this: "Fire is the way to test the purity of silver and gold, but the character of a man is tested by giving him a measure of fame." I love that. So there's this whole metaphor here in Proverbs talking about the purity of silver and gold, but also equating it with the character of a person, that we actually need to be tested in order to see the goodness that God has placed within us come to fruition and fullness. And then this passage here from Malachi chapter 3, verse 2, he says, "But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. Then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings in righteousness, and the offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be acceptable to the Lord, as in days gone by, as in former years." So he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. So here in Malachi, it's actually describing the process of God as the goldsmith, God as the refiner of the gold. And I actually did a little bit of a study, I guess, a little bit of looking into what a goldsmith does when they're refining gold. And I just found it to be such a helpful metaphor and understanding the way that God deals with us through these times of refining. The first thing is this: the goldsmith sits very close to the crucible. The gold is placed into the crucible and it's heated up until it melts. And the goldsmith stays close. He never leaves it. And the reason is that he has to have the heat at exactly the right temperature for the dross to be removed from the metal. So what happens is that it melts and it boils and it kind of simmers away. But what's happening is that the dross then comes to the surface and the goldsmith can scoop it off the top, scoop it off the surface. But there's also a danger that if the heat is too hot, then the metal will be marred and then it won't be precious anymore, it'll be ruined. And so he has to keep the heat at the absolute perfect temperature. He scrapes the dross off the surface after it lifts from the metal, and he sits there the entire time through the process, controlling the heat. He knows exactly how hot the fire needs to be, and he turns up the heat little by little, just little by little, until all of the impurities are out. And I love that, even that within itself, this image of God who would not even leave us in the midst of that fire, in the midst of that storm, in the midst of that hardship, that he would be right there, that he would be so close, and he would never leave, not for 1 second, because he didn't want for that challenge, for that fire to mar us, to harm us, but rather that he would just be there turning it up little by little by little by little, allowing the heat to be at exactly the right level for the impurities to be lifted out of us, and so that he can scrape them off the top. The goldsmith takes the greatest pains with the most precious of metals. So the more precious the metal, the more intense his focus. And then this, I think, is just absolutely beautiful. When he can see his face reflected in the metal, he turns off the fire. He turns off the heat. And that, I think, is just the absolute clincher. When he can actually see his face reflected in the metal, that's the time that he turns off the heat. That's when he knows the impurities are out, because he can actually see his own face reflected. And that's true of goldsmiths, but it's also true of the Lord. It's also true of the way that God uses the refining process for us. He doesn't necessarily always place the storms and the fire around us. Sometimes they are placed there by external factors, by the enemy, sometimes even by our own choices. But he will always use a storm and a fire to refine us if we will allow ourselves to be a part of that process. And so as he engages in that, as he sits there by the crucible and just gently turning up the heat, waiting for those impurities to come to the top, I guess our response in the midst of that is to say, I'm going to comply with that. I'm going to submit to that process, and I'm going to see and expect that he will bring his fullness in me to the point where he can actually see his reflection in me, that somehow we would submit to that process and we would say, Lord, I want for all of those impurities to come to the surface. I want for them to come out of me so that you can scrape those off the top, so that you'd be able to see a pure version of me and that you'd be able to see your face reflected in who I am.
This is The Spotlight, and we've been listening to part of a devotion by Heather from Faith and Fostering, exploring how a goldsmith refines gold and how this is illustrated in our lives as we begin to reflect God's image. You can hear the full episode in the free Vision app. Just tap the podcast tab and search in the Faith and Fostering channel for the episode, The Refining Process. There are many more episodes of Faith and Fostering in the Vision app, with new ones added each week. If you have a favourite podcast or video series that you'd like to hear featured on The Spotlight, click Contact Us at vision.org.au and share the link. My name is Jen Spiker. Join me next time as I highlight another podcast or video worth sharing.
For more great podcasts and videos like the one featured today, check out vision.org.au or the free Vision app.